Hello everyone. Before starting the video, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe to my channel. Thanks. Introduction. My previous video was about how to configure management access control in a RUCKUS Unleashed network. I configured everything step by step to show you that, how many ways are there, through which we can restrict or allow clients access to the Unleashed network. In this video, I am going to show you step by step, how we can downgrade the firmware of a RUCKUS access point, from Unleashed to standalone or, also known as solo firmware. So, be with me and watch the full video. I suggest not skipping any part of the video. Step number 1. Finding the IP address of the access point. Whenever we have to upgrade or downgrade the firmware of a network device, we must first know the IP address of that device, before starting the upgrade or downgrade firmware process. The question is, how would we find the IP address of our access point, if it is connected to the network and acting as a member AP of our RUCKUS Unleashed network? Let me explain. It is a little bit tricky to downgrade the firmware from Unleashed to standalone of an access point, acting as a member AP of the RUCKUS Unleashed network, so, the best way to downgrade the firmware of such an access point, first of all, we have to disconnect that AP from the Unleashed network and then directly connect it to our PC or laptop. But, before disconnecting an access point, whose firmware has to be downgraded, we must find the IP address of that access point. To find the IP address of an access point, acting as a member AP of a RUCKUS Unleashed network, go to the RUCKUS Unleashed network web management interface and, after logging in, check the IP address of that specific access point. There are two scenarios to consider regarding finding the IP address of an access point joined the RUCKUS Unleashed network. Scenario 1. Static IP address. If a static IP address is assigned to that specific access point, then simply log into the RUCKUS Unleashed network web management interface and then note down that IP address. Now disconnect the AP from the Unleashed network and then directly connect it to the PC or laptop via Ethernet cable. Scenario 2. Dynamic IP address, DHCP. If the AP is set to receive its IP address dynamically via DHCP server, things get a little more complex. If this is the case, then what do we do? If it is set to dynamic IP address, then this access point will get an IP address from the DHCP server on the network. Let's suppose we note down the IP address of the access point, which is set to get an IP address from the DHCP server, by logging into the RUCKUS Unleashed network web management interface. But, what will happen if we disconnect that access point from the network? Because we will have to directly connect it to our PC or laptop. If we disconnect that AP from the RUCKUS Unleashed network and connect it with our PC or laptop directly via Ethernet cable, then there will be no DHCP server available for that access point to get a reserved and unique IP address from. Now, the question is, what IP address will be assigned to that specific AP? So, I will tell you what to do, if this is the case. Simply, do a hard reset that access point. Power on the AP. Wait for about 2 minutes for the AP to get into the stable mode and then directly connect it to the PC or laptop. A hard reset will restore the access point to its factory default settings. Hence, the default IP address of a RUCKUS access point, after resetting to factory default settings, will be 192.168.0.1. It does not matter which firmware the access point has. It will always be assigned the default IP address of 192.168.0.1. If you don't know how to hard reset a RUCKUS access point, then watch my other video on the How to Hard Reset a RUCKUS AP topic. I will leave the link in the description. This is the only way to find the IP address of an access point, which is set to get an IP address from the DHCP server. I hope, now we all have an idea about how we can find out an IP address of our access point. Let's proceed towards the next step. Step number 2. Connecting the access point directly to PC or laptop. To downgrade the firmware of a RUCKUS access point from unleashed to standalone, it is very important that we must connect our access point directly to our PC or laptop via Ethernet cable. As we can see, I have unmounted my access point from the wall and will connect this AP directly to my laptop. This is because, if I try to downgrade the firmware of an access point via RUCKUS Unleashed Network Web Management Interface, while it is connected to the Unleashed network, it will be a little complex to downgrade the firmware of an access point from unleashed to standalone using the Unleashed Web Management Interface. Now, from the rear side, we will insert the power pin into the access point. Second, I will insert one end of the Ethernet cable into the simple RJ45 port of my access point. I will not use the PoE port of the access point because I am using a separate power adapter for my access point. Now take another end of the Ethernet cable and insert it into the laptop's Ethernet port. Insert the power adapter into the power plug. The red LED light will turn on, indicating the access point has now power connectivity. It will take a moment and we will wait until the red LED light changes to green. We can see that the LED light is now green and stable, which means the access point has been successfully powered on and in stable mode. If I check the Ethernet port on my laptop, the LED light on my laptop's Ethernet port is also blinking, which means that the access point and my laptop are connected properly. Now, let's go towards the next step. Step number 3. Downgrading the firmware from unleashed to standalone or solo firmware. Now, I will show you, after connecting the access point to our PC or laptop, how to downgrade the firmware of a RUCKUS AP from unleashed to standalone or solo firmware. Since I have connected the access point to my laptop's Ethernet port, so I assign two static IP addresses of different networks to my laptop's Ethernet port. One IP address is of my test network that I am working on, and the IP address of my test network, configured on my laptop's Ethernet port, is 10.0.2.56. The second IP address that I have configured on my laptop's Ethernet port is 192.168.0.10 from the default network of RUCKUS access point. The question may arise in our mind that, why did I add these two different IP addresses on my laptop's Ethernet port? This is because my access point has a static IP address of 10.0.2.40, which is the IP address of my test network. So, to access the web interface of my access point, I must assign the same network's IP address to my laptop's Ethernet port. As we all know, both the devices, the laptop and the access point, can properly communicate with each other if configured with the IP addresses of the same network. If both the devices have IP addresses of different networks, then routing is mandatory for proper communication. The second IP address of 192.168.0.10 will be required once the firmware is downgraded successfully. All the configuration will be restored to the factory default settings and the access point will be assigned an IP address of the RUCKUS default network, which is 192.168.0.1. So, once all the configurations are restored to the factory default settings, then this IP address will help us to communicate with and accessing the web interface of our AP. Another reason to configure the second IP address of the default network is that, if we hard reset our access point, in case we don't know the IP address, then, again, all the configuration of the access point will be restored to the factory default settings and the default IP address of 192.168.0.1 will be assigned to the RUCKUS AP. So, in any case, for communication with the access point, having either an IP address of our test network or the RUCKUS default network, assigning these two different IP addresses will be helpful for communication with the access point and to access the web interface as well. Always remember that, to avoid any conflict, never, ever, assign the default IP address of 192.168.0.1 to your PC or laptop, because this is the default IP address of RUCKUS access point, which will be assigned to the AP, if restored to the factory default settings. I will show you both these IP addresses later on in this video, that I assigned to my laptop's Ethernet port. Now, I will start with checking the connectivity between my access point and the laptop. So, to check the connectivity with the access point, I will open the command prompt on my laptop and I will type the ping command, followed by the current IP address of the access point, which is 10.0.2.40. Press the Enter button. We can see that the access point is responding, which means the access point is connected to my laptop properly and is communicating well. I will minimize the command prompt page. Now, I will access the web management interface of my access point. To do that, I will open an internet browser and type the full URL into the address bar. Press the Enter button. On this page, press the Advanced button and then the link given below. The login page appears. Remember that, since this access point was a member of the RUCKUS Unleashed network, the username and password will be the same as of the RUCKUS Unleashed network. So, enter the username and password here, and then press the Unleash button. On the main page of the web management interface, scroll down and go to the Admin and Services tab. Click on this tab to expand it. Then click on the Upgrade option, under the Administration tab. Because we have disconnected this access point from the Unleashed network, that is why, it will show the only access point on the web management interface, that is itself. Since I am going to downgrade the firmware locally, I will have to select the firmware file from laptop, that is the reason I have downloaded and saved the latest available standalone firmware file on the desktop. Now, select the option Local Upgrade. Below, it will now ask to select an image file, and then upgrade. Press the Browse button. Now, I will navigate to the desktop, where I have downloaded and saved the firmware file. This is the firmware file that I downloaded. .bl7 is the extension of this file. So, always download the firmware file with .bl7 extension. If you don't know how to download the exact firmware file for your AP, then watch my other video on this topic. I will leave the link in the description. Select the firmware file and then press the Open button. Wait for a moment, it will start uploading the firmware file. After uploading the firmware file, it is now processing. When processing is done, a confirmation message appears, asking to take a backup before starting the downgrade firmware process. If you want to save the backup file, then simply press the OK button and then save the backup file first. Since I am working on my test network and I do not want to save the backup file, so I will press the Cancel button. After pressing the Cancel button, it will display the full firmware file name that we selected. Press the Upgrade button to start the process. Wait for a moment, until the loading process finishes. Once the loading file process is completed, at the bottom, in the Details table, if we check the column Upgrade Progress, it says Success 100%. Means that firmware upgrade or downgrade process has been completed successfully. Now, simply press the Reboot button to restart the access point. This screen will appear, saying, Rebuilding the unleashed network. It may take a few minutes. Do not be confused with the message, Rebuilding the unleashed network. Since this access point had an unleashed firmware installed and we are downgrading the firmware, that is the reason it says, Rebuilding the unleashed network. But don't worry. When this process completes, the firmware will be downgraded to the standalone. But remember that, once the firmware is downgraded to the standalone, all the configurations will be restored to factory default settings, so we must wait. I will forward the video, wherever it is required to save the time. Meanwhile, I will show you the IP addresses of different networks that I assigned to my laptop's Ethernet port. I have already accessed the Network Connections page. I will open it and then, right-click on the Ethernet adapter. Press the Properties option. Now, select the Internet Protocol version 4, and then press the Properties button. Press the Advanced button. Under the IP address section, we can see the IP addresses. These are the two IP addresses of different networks that I assigned to my laptop's Ethernet port. I mean, the IP address of my test network and the default network of RUCKUS access point. We can see both the IP addresses, as I mentioned before in this video. I will close the Network Adapters Properties page. Now, I will open the command prompt and again, type the ping command, followed by the IP address of the access point from my test network, with -T switch to continuously monitor the communication with the access point. The same way, in the second command prompt page, I will type the same command with -T switch, but the IP address will be the default IP address of RUCKUS access point, which is 192.168.0.1. Why am I doing this? I will continuously monitor the response from both the IP addresses, as I mentioned that, after downgrading the firmware, from unleashed to standalone, all the configuration of the access point will be restored to factory default settings. So will be the IP address of the access point. Since the access point is in reboot process, that is the reason, for now, we are getting no response from any of the IP addresses. I will forward the video here, till the reboot process is about to complete. The process is about to complete. I mean rebuilding the unleashed network, or, we can say, the downgrading firmware process is just completing now. So let me open both the command prompt pages again, to monitor the communication with both the IP addresses of the access point. From the IP address of my test network, 10.0.2.40, we are still getting no response. If I check the response from the default IP address of the access point, we can see that the access point is responding well on the default IP address of the RUCKUS access point. Means that the IP address of the access point has been changed from the IP address of my test network, 10.0.2.40, to the default IP address of 192.168.0.1, which is the default IP address of the RUCKUS access point. It means that the firmware of this access point has been downgraded from unleashed to standalone. That is the reason the IP address has also been changed to the RUCKUS AP's default network. Here we are. The process has been completed successfully. Since the IP address has been changed to the default IP address of RUCKUS network, that is why we can no longer access the web interface using the IP address of my test network. If I open a new tab and then enter the full URL address, but this time I will enter the IP address of the RUCKUS default network and press the enter button. This page appears. Click on the Advanced button, and then the link given below. The login page opens. We can see that the login page is changed now. The login button is available now, instead of the unleash button. This is because it has been downgraded successfully. Remember that, this time enter the default username and password. The default username is super and the default password is sp-admin. After entering the default credentials, press the Login button. Upon pressing the Login button, it will take us to the Change Password page. Once the configurations are restored to the factory default settings, then, upon accessing the web interface for the first time, it will ask us to change the password. But, let me tell you that, in some cases, I also noticed that, it doesn't even ask to change the password. Then do not worry. All we have to do is, just do a hard reset the access point. Now, I will type the new password and then, retype it again for confirmation. Upon pressing the Submit button, it will now redirect us to the login page again. This time, we will use the default username sp-admin, but the password will be the new one that we recently changed. Enter the credentials and then press the Login button. On the main page of the web interface, if we check the software version, this is the exact firmware version that was downloaded and saved on the desktop. That's it, we have successfully downgraded the RUCKUS access points firmware from unleashed to standalone or solo firmware. I hope we all now have a better understanding of how we can downgrade a RUCKUS firmware. If you like this video, then do not forget like, share and hit the subscribe button. Next video. Users and roles management on a RUCKUS Unleashed network. In my next video, I will demonstrate that, how we can create additional users and roles on a RUCKUS Unleashed network. I will also practically demonstrate that, how we can assign different roles that we create to these additional users. Hi. If you liked this video, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Also leave your query in the comments section below. I will be more than happy to entertain. Thanks.